Welcome. The Civil War did more than just initiate a change in the United States' approach to slavery and the Union. It also marked the beginning of a new approach to the Constitution. Before 1865, the Constitution had seen 12 amendments. All were made by the same generation that wrote the Constitution, and the first 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified together in 1791. The 11th Amendment was ratified in 1795 and the 12th Amendment in 1804. But then, for the next 61 years, no amendments were added. Today, we'll look at how the Civil War and Reconstruction saw the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And we'll look at how they set the stage for subsequent approaches to the Constitution. Beginning in 1861, with the onset of the Civil War, literally hundreds of amendments were proposed in order to avert the dissolution of the Union. This was a real shift from how amendments had been viewed and treated for the previous 50 years. Although the Constitution allowed for the ratification of amendments, by the time of the Civil War, many people had come to view the Constitution as a kind of sacred document, and thus change was largely off limits. Abraham Lincoln is a good example. As he said in 1848, "As a general rule, I think, we would do much better to let it alone. No slight occasion should tempt us to touch it." He further said, "New hands have never touched it. The men who made it have done their work and have passed away. Who shall improve on what they did?" From this perspective, the generation that wrote the Constitution and ratified 12 amendments had basically finished their work. By the time of the Civil War, subsequent attempts at passing amendments had all failed, in large part because of perspectives such as Lincoln's. But the threatened dissolution of the Union changed this state of affairs. The 13th Amendment was proposed on January 31st, 1865. This was before the Civil War ended on April 9th of that year, and also before President Lincoln's assassination on April 15th. The amendment was finally ratified at the end of the year on December 6th. Building on President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, the amendment abolished slavery. It's divided into two sections. The first is really quite blunt. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This did not just pertain to the states of the Confederacy, because some slave states had remained part of the Union during the Civil War. Rather, the amendment pertained to all states. It thereby made constitutional President Lincoln's wartime act of emancipation. And then, in a very short second section, the amendment continues. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The previous 12 amendments had no such conclusion, and this initiated a very significant constitutional shift by delegating to the federal government, for the very first time, the right of enforcing an amendment. The 13th Amendment thereby not only abolished slavery, but also strengthened federal authority. It was another 3 years before another amendment was passed, but during this time, Congress passed another significant law. Although not a constitutional amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was no less groundbreaking than the 13th Amendment. And that's because it was the first civil rights law in American history. The act stated, quite bluntly, that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. It then specified that this included full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. But this wasn't just about individual rights. It was also about federal authority, and this had a further influence on the 14th and 15th Amendments. July 9, 1868 saw the ratification of another amendment, the 14th Amendment. It was a bit more complex, containing 5 sections. The first section pertained to citizenship. Its opening line reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." But this wasn't just an assertion that former slaves were citizens. It was, in fact, a complete redefinition of American citizenship itself, because until the 14th Amendment, there was no national citizenship in the United States. Rather, citizenship had existed exclusively at the state level. Put somewhat more bluntly, the first section of the 14th Amendment created American citizenship. This same section then subsumed state law to the rights of national citizenship. The very next clause reads, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." And the section concludes by requiring due process and equality under the law. The second section of the 14th Amendment defined voting privileges for all male citizens of at least 21 years of age. Women at the time were not allowed to vote. But the second section of the amendment also allowed for the restriction of voting rights by those who participated in insurrection. And the third section followed suit. It rejected the electability of any previously elected officials who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. And then this clause stepped back a bit by allowing Congress to reconsider. Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Here again, we see Congress at the center. The amendment's fourth section again discussed insurrection. It denied that the federal government could incur debt for 2 things. First, putting down insurrection, and second, freeing slaves. And finally, like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment concluded with almost identical wording. The Congress shall have power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. So, yet again, we find a strengthening of federal authority. At this point, we need to pay close attention to the precise wording of the amendments. The 13th Amendment directly addressed slavery. The 14th Amendment built on this by applying rights to former slaves. Its opening clause specified that the amendment pertained to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Presumably, this included immigrants, that is, persons born elsewhere but naturalized as citizens. However, there was actually quite a lot of debate on point. Here we see a clear example of the expansion of democracy in American history. Throughout the United States at that time, and not just in the former Confederacy, diverse limitations were placed upon the right to vote. For example, the state of Rhode Island created property qualifications in order to limit voting rights of Irish Catholic immigrants. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, there was significant anti-Chinese prejudice, and restrictions were placed on the voting rights of Chinese Americans. The 15th Amendment was thus ratified on February 3, 1870, and it contains 2 sections. The first reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." And then the 15th Amendment concluded with the exact same words as the 13th Amendment. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. By 1870, therefore, the 13th Amendment's second clause had become a well-established constitutional precedent. So what? It might not seem like much, but the conclusion of the 13th Amendment was unprecedented. At the risk of being repetitive, please recall that the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights contained no such clause. The 11th and 12th Amendments also lacked any such directive, but the 14th and 15th Amendments followed the 13th, and, no less importantly, almost every subsequent amendment has explicitly identified congressional authority as the means for enforcing the amendment in question. Because of this, some historians even describe Reconstruction and its constitutional amendments as the second founding of the United States. For example, in 2015, David Quigley published Second Founding, New York City, Reconstruction, and the Making of American Democracy. There's also Eric Foner's book from 2019, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. Another example is Eileen Werman's 2020 volume, The Second Founding, An Introduction to the 14th Amendment. The list could go on, but this probably suffices. And yet, there is also a question that we ought to ask. Did someone, such as Abraham Lincoln, envision something like the 13th Amendment as a second founding? Or does the idea of a second founding say more about us than it does about those who lived over 150 years ago? After all, like most Americans, especially then, Lincoln held the Founding Fathers with a quasi-religious awe. He saw himself as maintaining and preserving the Union that they created. And so, although it may be helpful to see Reconstruction and its impact upon the Constitution as a second founding, it's no less important to remember that contemporaries sought to maintain the first founding. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a broad overview of Reconstruction, read Reconstruction, A Concise History by Alan Guelzo. He's an award-winning historian, and his book is exactly what it promises: a short but engaging overview of Reconstruction and its influence. Next, the background of Lincoln's approach to both the Constitution and the 13th Amendment is well covered in Lincoln and the 13th Amendment by Christian Samato. It's part of a larger series entitled The Concise Lincoln Library, and it's well worth your time. Finally, there's Eric Foner's volume, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. It's a great introduction to the second founding school of thought and its approach to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.